You are listening to Pacifica Radio's Democracy Now! As economies around the world continue to plummet from Asia to Russia to Latin America, we bring you a speech by America's leading dissident, Noam Chomsky, professor of linguistics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology.
Well, I want to at least mention quite a number of different topics. The mentions are inevitably going to be far too brief. Every one of them deserves intensive thought and discussion, and they're not at all comprehensive. But what I want to kind of suggest, if I can do it, is that these are some of the threads that ought to be woven together to give some kind of coherent picture of where we stand today, what kinds of problems we have to face, and where we might find at least a standpoint to begin to think about them in a constructive way. I want to go back a half a century. I think we live very much within an era that was more or less created then. There are occasional moments in human affairs where power relations make it possible to establish social and economic arrangements that actually merit the term world order. Merit might not be the right word. It's not necessarily a phrase that should be invested with positive connotations, as history amply reveals. One of the most dramatic and, in fact, most easily timed of those moments was about 50 years ago in the aftermath of the most devastating single catastrophe in human history, which took place right in the heartland of Western civilization. At the end of the war, the United States, of course, had an overwhelming share of global wealth and power, and perfectly naturally, dominant forces within the state corporate nexus in the United States planned to use that power to organize the world as much as they could in accord with their own conceptions of their interests and those they represented. Of course, there were conflicting visions, both at home and abroad, and they had to be contained, or better, rolled back, to borrow some Cold War rhetoric. That was done with varying degrees of success, but in fact the basic conflicts persist, and for elementary reasons. They persist because they're about fundamental values. They're about freedom, justice, human dignity, human rights. In a world of inequality, great inequality and great concentration of power, the real world, that is, these values quite commonly constitute an arena of conflict between centers of power and most of the rest. A good deal of history revolves around these conflicts in the last half century. There's no exception, and I'm sure the next will not be either. Well, at the onset of the current era, about half a century ago, the framers of the world order of that day, the new world order of that day, they faced these challenges everywhere. At home, what had to be contained, maybe rolled back, were the very strong commitments of a large majority of the population to social democratic ideals that the business world rightly perceived as a grave threat to their traditional dominance. They were the hazard-facing industrialists in the rising political power of the masses, as the National Association of Manufacturers put it in their internal literature. It was the crisis of democracy that was posed by a population that sought to enter the political arena as frightened liberal internationalist elites phrased essentially the same problem after the ferment of the 1960s, expressing particular concern about what they called the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young, which were failing to carry out their disciplining role properly. Similar problems were faced throughout the industrial world. They were enhanced by the prestige and appeal of the anti-fascist resistance which was a complex affair, but often had radical democratic thrusts. They were enhanced further by the discrediting of the traditional conservative order, which had been linked closely to the fascist system. Reinstating that traditional order in its essentials was a primary task of the early post-war years, and it was achieved to a large extent, often in not very pretty ways. As in the United States, this project continues. It's taken new forms in the last 25 years, as here and as throughout the world, under the guise of neoliberalism or economic rationalism or free market doctrine, which is permeated with a good deal of deceit, hypocrisy, maybe outright fraud. All of these issues are strongly, very, very much alive right now, here, Europe, and elsewhere. In the third world, the South, the developing world, as it's euphemistically called, similar problems were compounded by strong pressures, uncontrollable pressures to overturn the imperial systems and the legacy of dependency and subordination that they had left. The basic issues were very much the same in most of the world, but they're revealed with particular clarity, with starkest clarity, in Latin America, for the simple reason that the United States faced no challenge there, no outside challenge. So you see the principles operating in their purest form. The only challenge was there was a real challenge, but it was from the domestic population. No outside challenge. As in Europe, these conflicts in Latin America came to a head even before the war was over. In the case of Latin America, very dramatically in February 1945, at a hemispheric conference in Canada was not part of the Western Hemisphere in those days, remember, so Western Hemisphere means the United States to the south. The hemispheric, I don't think Canada attended the conference, and maybe I'm mistaken. The hemispheric conference was supposed to organize affairs of the hemisphere. We know from U.S. internal records now that the United States was deeply concerned with what the State Department called the philosophy of the new nationalism that was spreading all over Latin America, indeed all over the world, quoting State Department documents. The philosophy of the new nationalism, which embraced policies designed to bring about a broader distribution of wealth and to raise the standard of living of the masses, the principle that the first beneficiaries of a country's resources are the people of that country. That heresy is called radical nationalism or economic nationalism, and of course it has to be stamped out. The first beneficiaries of a country's resources are U.S. investors, their counterparts elsewhere, and local elites who are associated with them. At the hemispheric conference, the United States, given the power relations, of course the U.S. prevailed, and it imposed what was called an economic charter for the Americas, which called for an end to economic nationalism in all its forms. In the cruel and bloody history of the half-century that followed, these remain central themes, and they will continue to. They're very much alive today. Now they're often framed differently in the context of the investor rights agreements that are mislabeled free trade agreements, NAFTA, the forthcoming maybe multilateral agreement on investment, MAI, and the whole globalization, what's called globalization, which is a specific form of international integration, not by any means the only necessary form. It's the specific form that's crafted primarily to serve the interests of its designers, again, not terribly surprisingly, transnational corporations, financial institutions, and the bureaucracies that they control, and of course the major states that are part of the system.
You're listening to Noam Chomsky giving a speech at the University of Calgary in June of 1998, and we're going to be back with that speech in just a minute. And remember to call the networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, and ask why you don't even get a soundbite of Noam Chomsky. You are listening to Pacifica Radio's Democracy Now! We'll be back with him in a minute. You're listening to Pacifica Radio's Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman as we go back to Noam Chomsky speaking just a few weeks ago at the University of Calgary in Canada.
But let's turn to the second element of world order, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You will doubtless, we will all hear much rhetoric in the coming months about the universality of the high principles that are proclaimed and about the challenge of relativity that's posed by various bad guys around the world. Those charges will be accurate enough, unfortunately, but probably understated. But you're unlikely to hear about a different topic, namely U.S. adherence to the Universal Declaration, both in action and in doctrine. Well, again, I'll put aside action and just keep to the doctrine. If you look at the doctrine, you find out quickly that the United States is a leader of the relativist camp. One is unlikely to see headlines about that, but it's pretty clear. The United States dismisses one fundamental component of the Universal Declaration completely as having no status. That's the component that's concerned with the socioeconomic provisions, which have the same status as any others in the Universal Declaration, but the U.S. doesn't agree. They are a letter to Santa Claus, as Ambassador Gene Kirkpatrick put it. They are preposterous and dangerous incitement, as they were described by U.S. Ambassador Morris Abrams. He was, in fact, testifying at the part of the discussion of the UN Commission on Human Rights, which was considering a declaration on the right of development, which very closely paraphrased the socioeconomic conditions of the Universal Declaration, and which, incidentally, the U.S. proceeded to veto. Well, again, there's more to say, but let's proceed to the third point, the international economic order. The Bretton Woods system, as it's called, and its institutions, that's all over the front pages right now, with the fears of a global meltdown that might affect privileged folk like us, as well as just the usual victims, so therefore it moves. Well, the Bretton Woods system had two basic principles, set up institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, but it which are called the Bretton Woods institutions, but it had two basic principles which one has to keep in mind. They're important. One principle was to liberalize trade. The goal was to liberalize trade, more free trade. The second principle had to do with capital flow, and it was the opposite. The goal was to regulate capital flow and control it, keep fixed exchange rates, keep capital controls, and so on. That was agreed by both the U.S. and the British negotiators. The U.S. main negotiator was Harry Dexter White, the British John Maynard Keynes, and it expressed a very common conception at the time, which has a lot of plausibility. It's built into the rules of the IMF. So up till there's now an effort, the U.S. is leading an effort to try to change those rules. But up until now, although they've been breached many times, the rules of the IMF still authorize countries to regulate capital flow, and they prohibit the IMF from giving credits to cover capital flight. Any of you who follow these affairs will know how well that one's been observed. Anyhow, it is a rule. Well, there was thinking behind this. There were reasons. The reasons were in part theory, what some international economists call an incompatibility thesis, which in fact remains the guiding principle of UNCTAD, the main UN commission conference, it's called, on trade and development. The theory is that capital flight so short-term speculative flows, lead to exchange rate fluctuations and so on, that they're going to undermine trade. They're going to undermine trade and investment. So they're inconsistent with one another. Can't liberalize both. And recent experience is, I think, consistent with that assumption. The second reason was not a theory, it was a truism. The truism is that free flow of capital definitely undermines democracy in the welfare state, which was at that time far too popular to ignore. It's the mid-20th century. The basic point, I'm essentially paraphrasing White and Keynes here, the basic point is that capital controls allow governments to carry out monetary and tax policies to sustain unemployment, incomes, social programs, maintain public goods, without fear of capital flight, which will punish this irrational behavior. Irrational in that it's only for the benefit of people, not for the benefit of investors and speculators. And it will be punished by capital flight for obvious reasons. So capital, that's the essential point. Free flow of capital quickly creates what some international economists call a virtual Senate of financial capital, which will impose its own social policies by the threat of capital flight, which leads to higher interest rates, economic slowdown, budget cuts for health and education, recession, maybe collapse. It's a powerful weapon. All of that was articulated quite explicitly, and essentially the words I've used repeated at the time by the U.S.-UK negotiators, and it's not particularly controversial. In fact, not controversial at all now. If you think it through, it's kind of obvious as it was to them. And all of that is quite important to keep in mind in looking at the current period, because there's a challenge to that in the last 25 years, and we see the consequences. And it's now being reevaluated because the consequences are even hitting the rich people. That's where we are right now. Well, the Bretton Woods system as formulated, that is efforts to liberalize trade and regulate capital, that was in place. It was never, there were always discrepancies and so on, but in essence, it was in place to a substantial degree through the first half of this period, first quarter century after it was established. Now, that's what's sometimes called the golden age of post-war state capitalism. High rates of growth of the economy, of productivity, expansion of the social contract right through the 50s and the 60s. The system was dismantled from the early 1970s. Richard Nixon unilaterally abrogated its basic principles. Other major financial centers joined in. By the 1980s, capital controls were mostly gone in the rich countries. And the smaller economies, like South Korea, were simply compelled to drop them. That, incidentally, is widely regarded now as a major factor in its recent collapse, alongside of quite extreme market failures in the private sector throughout East and Southeast Asia, and also the West, which was involved in crazed lending. I should add at this point that in the light of the recent economic crisis in East Asia, that the more serious analysts recognize and insist that the East Asian economic miracle was quite real, and distinguishing East Asia from Southeast Asia here, they're quite different. So one of the most important and influential and, I think, intelligent, Joseph Stiglitz, who's now the chief economist of the World Bank, is formerly head of Council of Economic Advisors here, and it plays a very important role. He emphasizes in recent World Bank publications and elsewhere that this post-crisis, that the East Asian economic miracle was not only real, but it was, in his words, an amazing achievement, historically without precedent, and furthermore, he points out, based on very significant departures from the official doctrines, so-called Washington consensus, and that it should last, it should thrive, in fact, unless it's destroyed by irrational financial markets, as it could be. Stiglitz points out remember this is the chief economist of the World Bank I'm talking about in World Bank publications, that in East Asia, the basis for the amazing achievements and the miracle, which has no precedent, is that governments took major responsibility for the promotion of economic growth, abandoning the religion that markets know best, and intervening to enhance technology transfer, relative equality, education, health, along with, he doesn't stress this, but he should have, along with industrial planning and coordination, and in fact strict capital controls until they were forced to relinquish them in the last few years. Stiglitz also mentions, though he doesn't go into it, that the rich countries, every one of them, from England on through the United States up to the present, every single one of them had followed a somewhat similar path, actually far more so than the World Bank has yet acknowledged. Another big topic I can't go into, but an interesting one. Well, again, worth keeping in mind. Well, what has happened since the system, the Bretton Woods system, essentially collapsed in the early 1970s? It did end the golden age of post-war state capitalism. Just focusing on the rich countries, primarily the United States and Britain, although others, happens to others in various degrees in an integrated economy. Over the rich countries as a whole, the growth of the economy and the growth of productivity have slowed very markedly. Actually, contrary to what you read, trade also slowed, if you look closely. In the United States specifically, and England, incomes stagnated or declined throughout this period for the great majority of the population. Working conditions deteriorated. Social services have been significantly cut. Infrastructure is in serious danger with very little required public spending. The welfare state has significantly eroded. There has also been a closely correlated, dramatic increase in incarceration. It's closely correlated because a large part of the society is just becoming superfluous for wealth formation. In an uncivilized society, you send out the death squads to kill them. In a civilized society, you throw them in jail. Since 1980, when the system really took shape, was in place, at that time, incarceration rates in the United States were roughly like other industrial countries, kind of at the high end, but not off the scale. And so crime rates in the United States are not unusually high, contrary to what you read. I mean, again, sort of toward the high end, but not unusual, with one exception, namely killing with guns, but that's a separate matter. It has to do with laws, cultural patterns, so on, than anything to do with crime. And that remains the case. In fact, crime rates have declined since 1980. But the incarceration has gone way up. It's a reflection of I think it's a direct reflection of the inequality and the need for social control. It tripled in the 1980s. It's been rising very fast through the 1990s. It's now 5 to 10 times as high as other industrial societies. In fact, the U.S. is world champion in imprisoning its population, at least among countries where there's any minimally reliable statistics. If you take the prison population into account, that adds another 2% to the unemployment rate, which places the U.S. squarely in the middle of the European level. Actually, even without that, it's not at the bottom, believe it or not. It's about 30%. Of course, this requires a little, you have to decide what you're talking about. If you count in prison labor, which is not trivial and very good for folks like Boeing Aircraft and AT&T and others, terrific workforce. If you count them in, well, then of course the unemployment figures change again. High borrowing, highly leveraged character of investment, which is something new, incidentally. A lot of things are old, but this is new. That's accelerating the irrationality of markets. They've become financial markets. They've become much more volatile and unpredictable. There have been wildly fluctuating exchange rates related to speculative flows, and there have been increasing financial crises. The IMF really recently did a study of the period 1980 to 1995, 15-year period, and it found that about 80% of its roughly 180 members had had one or more banking crises, ranging from significant to quite serious. Again, that wouldn't have surprised Keynes and White or any of the framers of Bretton Woods or the economists or the thinking behind them. The same period, again in conformity with their thinking, has been an assault, an attack on free markets, a sustained assault on free markets, to quote the head of economic research of the World Trade Organization in a major technical study. That was led by the Reaganites. They were talking free markets for the poor, but doing something else for the rich. This analyst, Patrick Lowe, estimates the effect of Reaganite protectionist measures at about 3 times as high as those of the other industrial countries, which were bad enough. Well, again, that's what was expected. During the Reagan years, lots of lofty rhetoric, but protection was essentially virtually doubled. The public subsidy, which is another violation of free trade principle, was increased. Bailouts increased, both for domestic banks, international banks. In the United States, it's happened throughout the world, but mostly in the United States. In the United States, the goal was to somehow overcome very serious management failures that were leading to a decline of U.S. industry and were a matter of great concern at the time. All of this continues under Clinton alongside the free market rhetoric. Radical interference with free trade is standard when convenient.
Professor Noam Chomsky speaking in June 1998 at the University of Calgary in Canada. Noam Chomsky is professor of linguistics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, author of many books, well-known political and social critic. And that does it for today's program. Democracy Now! Is produced by Jeremy Scahill and Maria Carrion. Our technical director is Errol Maitland. Julie Drissen's our executive producer. Our website is www.pacifica.org. Our email address, democracy@pacifica.org. That's democracy@pacifica.org. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for listening to another edition of Pacifica Radio's Democracy Now!